You will be counted among the wise, he says in chapter 19, verse 20. And the same advice is true, harder to put into practice, but the same advice is true when we're hearing words not merely from a critic, but from a carping fault finder. The reality is that there are some people who seem to be more interested in venting than they are in having a conversation, who seem to be much more interested in making their opinion known than in hearing the perspective of others. And even though it's a much harder task in those cases to hear, it's profitable that we hear what's being said. And as we sift through it all, perhaps finding more chaff than wheat, who knows? But as we sift through it all, we may find a kernel in the midst of a lot of chaff, which we can take to heart, even in advice that's poorly given. So number one, assume that the person who is talking to you about something is really trying to assist you, not trying to harm you. That's true the vast majority of the time. And even when it's not true, when it's a carping critic, listen. Anyway. Number two, respond with statements, questions that seek to clarify, that ask for clarification, and not with statements of rebuttal. But whenever someone gave advice or a suggestion or a comment to one of my friends, I could tell you what his first two words of response were going to be. If I was a betting man, I could have won a lot of money. His first two words were, "Well, you," and there's a variety of ways to finish that, of course. "Well, you are not so good yourself. Well, you have a few things I could talk to you about. Well, you ought to practice what you preach." How natural it is when we hear something that we may not wish to hear to respond with some, "Well, you," kind of statements. The first response is defense, and often the first defense is an attack of the messenger who brings the message. Now, if you analyze all of those "well, you" statements, all of them are true. All of them are true. If I speak to you about something in your life, it's very easy for you to point out something in my life and say, "Well, you better take care of that yourself." Because after all of us have areas of weakness, and none of us are perfect, and that's sometimes what makes us kind of leery about saying anything to anyone about anything. Because we know that we're vulnerable to attack if the response of that person is an attack. And sometimes, "Well, you do exactly the same thing" is right on. What's the first thing that you notice in the life of someone else? I suspect it's something that you yourself struggle with. You pick it up like that because you're familiar with it. You're at home with it. It's part of you. And that's the double-edged sword, of course. The person who struggles with the same thing that I struggle with is well able to help me in my struggle. But that person is also very vulnerable when I say, "Well, you should practice what you preach." Yeah, I know that. Doesn't make it any less true that I should practice what I preach. I know that. "Well, you" statements are are rebuttal statements. They're defensive statements. They're statements that send a signal that I'm not going to be very open to listen to what you have to say to me. They're statements that attempt to switch the focus from me to the person who is seeking to resist me. The writer of the Proverbs says in chapter 12, verse 16, fools show their annoyance at once. Fools show their annoyance at once. Don't be foolish. Don't be foolish. When advice is given by another, remember that the focus is on you. The focus is not on the other person who is bringing the advice to you. The focus is on you, and it's foolish to attempt to somehow turn the tables, to take the focus off me and put it on the person who is bringing the message. It's time for me to benefit as much as I can from this person's insights, no matter how on or how off the mark I may think they are. Because criticism is difficult to give, and because it's so difficult to receive, the atmosphere gets a little tense, and the situation gets a little awkward, and both parties hope that this ends really soon, so we can go on to talk about more pleasant things. And the danger then, of course, is that criticism is not correctly heard. It's not correctly understood. Possible situations, possible solutions are not explored. How much better it is to have a conversation about what's said. How much better it is to say, now listen, help me understand exactly what you're saying. Give me a couple of examples which illustrate this so I can get a hold on it. Have you thought about any solutions, any steps that I could take so that I could improve this area of my life? Is this what you mean? Such conversations prevent us from guessing at what another person means, going away with a misunderstanding of what that person has actually said to us. It prevents us also from exaggerating what that person is saying to us. I'll bet that all of you have had an experience where someone comes to you and says, you know, I heard that you talked to so-and-so about such and such, and you said so-and-so, and you sort of say, what? Where did that conversation come from? I don't recognize any of the words that I said. When I was pastoring my first congregation many, many years ago, a minister friend of mine came up to me and said, do you realize that in your sermon, every time you referred to the second person of the Trinity, you called him Jesus Christ? And so throughout that whole sermon, I heard Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ. Now I could have responded in a whole variety of ways. I could have said, well, he's just trying to exert his superior over me. That's why he's talking to me like that. He just wants me to know that I'm just a young kid starting in the ministry and he's an old hand at this. Or I could have said, every single time I referred to the second person of the Trinity as Jesus Christ. I bet I didn't do that every single time. Or I could have said, you know, I'm going to go to his church sometime and I'm going to listen to one of his sermons. I'm going to see what I can say about a sermon that he preaches. Now all of those responses, of course, would have been possible.